So we're in the second week of this sermon or worship series called The Inheritance of God. And this week we're looking at the inheritance of attentiveness, being attentive. And I would tell you that good listeners are risk takers. Good listeners really do take a risk. Does everybody know what this is? This is a fake one. It doesn't work in any form or fashion. It just looks sort of like what it's supposed to be. Most people would call this a scale, right? You see it most often in the hands of Lady Justice, talking about the scale of justice. Its actual name is called a double pan balance. Now, aren't y'all glad I looked that up on Google and could share with you that important piece of information? But anyway, I bring that because it kind of illustrates something that I have been thinking about this week as I have been reading about the story of Elijah and about today, this time to bring you a message from the Lord. And what I have really been struggling with is this, that most of us today, and particularly people like me who make their living talking, seem to place more importance in this scale on words and talking than we do on listening and being attentive. Now, I will have to tell you, I hope that I balance that out during the week and I listen and I am attentive not only to what I hear God saying, but what I read and what I study to bring a message to you. But I will admit to you that I would say that a lot of us who are people who have the gifts of that, what I would call speaking gifts, which are teachers and preachers and prophets and those kind of things, we place a lot of importance on words, don't we? I mean, that's what we do. And speaking. As communicators of the gospel, we believe that words matter. But I believe that what this story in the book of 1 Kings is telling us when we hear about the prophet Elijah is that there is a great deal of need and there is a great importance placed on being attentive, particularly attentiveness to God. And I would tell you that we think there is more at stake when we talk than when we listen. Do you agree with that? I mean, you worry about what you're going to say, right? You really don't have any control over about what you listen to. I mean, you have what you listen to, but what you don't have any control over what you're hearing. But I would tell you that not paying attention is as risky, or not listening is as risky as anything that we might say. That's what I want us to think about today. Certainly, the dominance of speaking over listening reflects a lot about our Western culture. We hear people talk more than we listen, right? I mean, y'all have heard that thing. I didn't say this to the early group, but y'all have heard that thing. We got 2 ears and 1 mouth. You know, that really kind of tells you we ought to listen twice as often as we speak. And maybe there's some truth to that. But, you know, when you look at our world, you look at our political world, you know, the 2020 campaigns are already cranked up, right? And have you ever noticed politicians? They seem to talk and place a lot more importance on what they're saying than what they're listening to. Last night, I went to bed a little bit late. Marianne was watching some program that had some of the candidates for 2020. And all of them, I guess they had specific amounts of time. They were supposed to say, you know, things that they... And it was just word after word after word after word as to what they were going to do and how things were going to be better when they were president and all those things. It was just talk. They played much more importance on speaking than they did listening, right? But I also wonder how much importance we should put on the other side of that and really listening to what it is that our politicos have to say. We, meaning Western culture in general, have placed a lot of value on those who can risk putting themselves out there and saying what they think needs to be said. Okay? Listen, there is risk in talking, no doubt about that, right? I mean, some of you who are not people who like to get up in front of crowds and talk would say, just to get up and say a word, I'm taking a risk, right? But the truth is that when we say things, we are taking a risk. But what about the other side of that? What about when we take on this idea that maybe sometimes listening is more risky than speaking? So we get to this story today. Y'all have heard this story of Elijah, and I'll bet almost everybody here knows what story this story follows, right? This is chapter 19. It's when Elijah goes to be by himself. But y'all know what happened in chapter 18, right? This is when Elijah puts himself out there and says, look, I'm going to bring about this contest between the prophets of Baal and the prophets of God, and my God will prevail. And of course, y'all know the fire, y'all know the prophets of Baal were all slain and all those kind of things. And there is no question in the world that Elijah was a risk-taking communicator for God. He spoke the words God wanted him to speak. He did the things God wanted him to do. And immediately, it's always interesting to me that Elijah hears this message that says, Jezebel's out to get you, and although he's just called down fire from God to destroy all the prophets of Baal, he's running from this woman. Now, maybe there's a sense in that. But the truth is that he gets into a place now where his listening becomes more important than his speaking. And I will tell you that even for us communicators and for those who don't necessarily do this, kind of as a job or as a full-time devotion to God, as speaking for God or whatever, that we need to understand that there are times, and you as well need to understand there's times when listening is not only as important, but just as risky. So the passage that we're reading, we come to this understanding that Elijah makes a turn from being a risk-taking speaker to a risk-taking listener. Then, here's what happens. He goes, he flees. He lays down. He asks God to take his life. He said, I've done all there is to do. I've been the prophet of Israel for years. I have spoken exactly what you've said. I have even called down the greatest of confrontations between you and proved you to be the God of the universe. And now I'm done. I've done it all. Take my life. I'm ready to go. And he falls asleep. The angel feeds him bread and water, goes back to sleep, feeds him bread and water. I'm always also kind of amazed by this, that two portions of bread and 2 jars of water feed him for 40 days. That's what the word says. Now, my guess is he probably had to get a snack somewhere else along the way. But it says that in the nourishment of that food, he goes on for 40 days, journeys to the Mount of Horeb, Mount Horeb, which is the mountain of God. He finds a cave and he falls asleep. And in that cave, he hears the voice of God that says, go out, stand on the mountain. I'm about to pass by. Now, this is where it really gets interesting to me in some ways, and that is, the first thing that happens is a wind comes that is so powerful, it shakes the mountains, it breaks open the rocks. Now, we in Southeast Texas know about wind, don't we? Y'all have experienced some sometimes. But listen, I've yet, even in, I think Ike was windier than Harvey was, but even in Ike, I don't remember, rocks splitting. And rocks were splitting. And they were flying. You got to believe they were flying right past Elijah, right? Just y'all been in a place where debris's been picked up by wind, I know, and you see something flying by. Well, listen, this is the rocks and the mountain that's moving by your face right now. And it's moving right by you. And then it says there's an earthquake, and then there's this fire. Now, I was a volunteer fire for a long time. I know what it's like my face to be faced with fire. And it's not all that pleasant, all right? But here's the thing that always puzzles me. All of that happens, and then what? Sheer silence. Silence. Sheer silence. And what does Elijah do? He takes his mantle, he wraps it around his head, and he covers his face. I don't know about you, I would have rather covered my face when the rocks were flying by. I would rather have covered my face when the fire was about to burn my nose. Well, but not Elijah. Any of y'all know Morris Matthys? I told this story this morning. Anybody know Morris? Morris is a former DS. He's now the Center for Clergy Excellence right now. A friend of mine, we call him my cousin by another mother because his name is spelled by one letter different than mine. And Morris and I both, but Morris more so recently than I, has been riding distance on road bikes. And he posted a picture yesterday of him. He had his first crash in 13 years. And he had 23 stitches on his face. His face was pretty beat up. He said he had stitches in his knee and some in his finger. And, of course, I responded, because he and I have ridden together several times, and I responded. I was praying for his recovery. And then I said, and I'm so sorry that when I had the only crash I remember, I hit my shoulder and my hip and my knee, and I have big spots on my shoulder this big that are solid white from a scar, but it didn't mess up my face. You see, because all those who like to talk, we sort of like to have a face that's able to be looked at, right? So I said, I'm so sorry that it was your face that got messed up. And so I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking communicators, and not that I'm pretty in any means, but the truth is that I don't want a big scar on my face when I'm talking, because people are going to be looking at the scar instead of listening to what I say. And, poor Morris, he's going to have this big scar across there. But I believe as a communicator, I would have covered my face with a mantle when I was at the most risk. Do you hear that? That the most danger, and the question is, did he? Did he cover his face during the most danger? You see, because in the still small voice, Elijah knew that it might be the biggest risk of all, is to listen deeply for what it is God had in store for him. You see, I believe that God has spoken to us, and there have been times when I would say I have listened to the risky message of God, and I have listened and I have followed it. And here's I cannot think of a time, this is my absolute witness to you, that when I do, it turns out well. Now, some of you may know I went into ministry late in life. And when I was going into ordination process, which takes about 5 years, I had lots of people tell me, you're too old, they won't ordain you. You're being silly. Because in our conference at that time, they were ordaining young people, not just terribly much older people. But here I was, what I was convinced of, that it was me listening to God, maybe in silence, but in a place where I was fully convinced that it was the voice of God that says, I am calling you to this ministry. And so I was going to follow that and do what God was calling me to do. And if they didn't ordain me, it's God's fault. And I believe that God, if he wants me to be ordained, is going to take care of the Board of Ordained Ministry for the Texas Annual Conference, and they're going to do what God wants them to do. And here I am, now have been ordained about 5 years. And so if you follow what you know you hear in that still small voice, I will testify to you every time it's going to turn out okay. But here's what I also know. We don't listen every time. I will tell you, every clergy brother and sister of mine that I know will tell you there have been times when they did not listen and they did not do the will of God. Now, I'm not telling you there's been lightning that struck and any of them, were harmed, But when we and when you and when I and when the church listens for what it is that God has for us to do, and we are attentive, then I believe things are going to go well. Now, I don't know how much you know about the rest of the story of Elijah, but to the place where we read today, he stands before God, the still small voice, wraps himself to protect him from the most risky danger of the day, which is to hear what God has for him to say. And do you remember what he prayed that night under the broom tree? Let me die. I have done it all. I am okay. I believe he was saying, I'm okay with life. I have done what you've asked. I believe, unlike most people of the Old Testament, I believe he probably thought there's something else for him in a second life. But for him, God wasn't done yet. You see, and there was another risk that he had to take. And it's so subtle, and it's so plain to me in this particular scripture that he does two things. One is, when after the small voice, I'm assuming he unwraps his mantle from his face and is still talking with God, and he says, what are you doing here? It's the second time God asks him, he says, what are you doing here? And you know the answer he gives? Word for word, the first answer he gave. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been either a little bit afraid or maybe a little bit put back or a little bit, maybe even a little bit miffed at somebody who asks you a second time the exact same question, and so you give them the exact same answer, word for word? And maybe it's just, I didn't want to have to think about this again. God, you asked me once, and I said that I've done it all. I'm okay, and yet you ask me again. But then what does God do? He says, well, pick up your stuff and not go over to the city. He says, I want you to travel through the wilderness of Damascus. Friends, God may call us to a risky place. I have got to believe that the wilderness of Damascus is a risky place, not a place where you're going to find food and water and everything you need to sustain yourself. But he was saying, look, I have called you. I have provided for you. Yes, all those things you said are true. You were zealous for me. You spoke when I asked you to speak. And now I'm going to put you in the wilderness where you can discover one thing and one thing for sure, and that is you can rely on nothing but me. And he does. Very quickly, he passes that mantle on to his successor, Elijah. But he had something else for him to do. Let me ask you a question. What is God calling you to do? What risk, if you really dig deep down into the depths of your ability to listen, what is God calling you to do? What is God calling us to do? And here is the truth that I have absolute no question about, is that whatever it is that God puts on our hearts over the next year, over the next 2 years, that if we listen and if we follow, God will bring us through every wilderness just like he does Elijah, and it will be good. Amen.